Malcolm is hardworking and kind. I remember his smile and unmoved positive attitude throughout high school. He's gone on to found his own non-for-profit for English-speaking youth in Quebec, and he now works with the largest union of public service professionals. Like myself, Malcolm also studied geography in university. Malcolm has worked in politics with the House of Commons and with other political parties. And overall, I admire Malcolm for being an active member of the community, trying to improve people's lives. So Malcolm, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Toby, for having me.
Yeah, glad you can be here. So maybe you could give us more in depth of what you've actually been up to recently and what's your work like.
So as you mentioned, I have two main vocations today. So I work in communications at the Professional Institute of the Public Service of Canada, PIPS, and I'm the volunteer president of Y4Y Quebec. I'm the outgoing president, though, because I did announce that I'm not going to solicit a new mandate, so the board is going to select a new president to take over. And I'm proud of what we've accomplished over the last several years, advocating for English-speaking youth in Quebec as a linguistic minority. It's a pretty particular linguistic minority community in Canada because our language is not threatened, and actually in some parts of Quebec we see the number of English speakers actually increasing, like in Montreal. So it's very different from the French-speaking linguistic minority communities in other provinces, where for them it's a totally different set of issues that their official language minority communities need to work on and focus on. Totally different when we talk about schools and different regional expressions and using the minority language in the public place. Yeah, as you mentioned, after high school, I went into a French language university because I really wanted to be able to build more bridges, I think, with the French-speaking community, and I thought it would be a really interesting door to open for me. So I went to study geography at first. I eventually, though, went to study linguistics afterwards because I realized grammar is one of my great interests, and I'm lucky to be able to use knowledge of French grammar in my job every day today.
So yeah, maybe get a bit into kind of like transition you had from Y4Y and like your most recent venture. You mentioned that you're doing communications now, but what was that transition like for you, and how did you go from Y4Y into this latest thing?
Super interesting that you bring that up because, as a labor union, PIPS advocating for the interests of public servants, I see a lot of parallels in between the public service professionals that we work to represent throughout Canada and the English-speaking youth community in Quebec, because they can both get the perception as sort of privileged communities. As public servants, they're really lucky to have, we advocate for strong pensions, strong benefits, job stability, and those are things that public service professionals are able to enjoy thanks to the strength of a union behind them. So that's one thing. On the other hand, with English-speaking youth in Quebec, we're lucky to have institutions for our community that have withstood the test of time and that are still around. McGill, Concordia, and Bishop's University. Also the health institutions. I mean, there's no official English hospital, but there are hospitals that have closer ties to the English-speaking community and where you can get easier access to healthcare services. But if you compare like this community, the English-speaking community in Quebec, to the kinds of educational opportunities, for instance, that French-speaking youth have outside of Quebec, it's a big struggle for Franco-Ontarians, for instance, just to get their own university, a first French language university in Ontario. It took a massive mobilization from young people in particular to get to this point where we are today. Governments going back and forth, tearing their shirts off, really getting into huge national fights about this, just opening a French university in Ontario. So we're not at that point of having these huge national uprisings, but for English-speaking youth in Quebec, we do have some looming, I think, societal questions, and if I may use the word battles, we might have some big things to deal with in the future. I'm thinking notably about accessing public CEGEPs. Right now, the CEGEPs are open to any adult that chooses to, or any young adult that chooses to go and study, whether you're coming from an English or French high school. That's a question that comes up every election campaign. Should Francophone youth be able to go to English CEGEPs? And eventually, if a government wants to legislate to change that, that's one thing that could happen that would have a pretty significant impact on our community. Another thing, the strengthening of the Office québécois de la langue française. It's not intended as a strike against the English community. However, when we look at the facts and the number of fines that are given out, the fines from the OQLF tend to hit small businesses, the ones that have less than 50 employees, the ones that the French language minister said that they're going to be targeting with this new $5 million that was announced in Quebec's most recent budget. And those are businesses that are really struggling to make ends meet in a lot of cases, especially this year, now that their business in a lot of cases for retail stores has plummeted. So I question the good foundedness and the rationale really to bring in these measures that are going to focus on small businesses in Quebec.
Yeah, well, even hearing you talk about these different issues around the government and different legislation, like I wondered how you kind of got into this sphere too. Like I see a lot of your work is involved in the political sphere of governments, whether it's federal level or whether it's party politics. I don't know, maybe you could get a bit more into like how you kind of got into that realm and what you see as kind of your role in that, or how important is that to be a part in politics?
I would say that my interest for politics and for volunteering go hand in hand. I remember when at my CEGEP, I got to meet my local member of parliament and the assistant for our provincial member of the National Assembly. And that was a moment that sort of put into my mind that, hey, these people are not actually so distant from us. They're here in our communities. They're representing us politicians. And if we have an issue that, we're not happy with in terms of how the government functions, we really should bring it to their attention. They have some responsibility to reach out to us, but we also have a responsibility to reach out to them. And my perception about politicians has changed a lot over the years. Like, I remember when I was in high school, I was really disenchanted by our local federal politician, our federal MP, who I'll tell a brief anecdote. In high school, our environmental committee launched a campaign to convince the town of Montreal West to pick up recycling from our school. And what happened was that they passed this bylaw, this archaic bylaw, prohibiting recycling collections for institutions. I don't know the exact number, but over, I think, 500 people. And it was a bylaw designed to target our school. There's no other institution that welcomed over that threshold. They made it so that the city did not have to collect recycling from the school. Today, for me to explain that, I think would appear bonkers to most listeners. And the federal MP came around and sort of took credit for this new change, even though it had nothing to do with the federal level. She was just there to make a nice speech. It really was purely a municipal decision. So I think that was one example that really impacted me and made me think that, well, we really have to be vigilant, because I don't know if she actually had anything to do with it, or maybe she, behind the scenes, she wrote letters or something, but it was clearly not a federal issue. But it was not clear for most of the people that were in attendance at that speech that she was not the politician responsible for that kind of issue. So first of all, education and being able to have a critical view on what politicians are saying, I think that's really important. And in Quebec, for the English-speaking community, we don't have enough news sources about what's happening in Quebec that are in English. Sometimes I tease my parents that they watch too much American television. They always have CNN playing. They never watch television about local politics. And it's, I think, because the coverage, it's not as easily accessible. There aren't as many information sources about what's going on in Quebec that are in English. So it's just easier to consume media from outside in a lot of cases. So I don't blame them. But I wish that we can get to a point where there are more people from the English-speaking community in Quebec that are taking leadership roles and that are becoming more engaged with our different institutions. So that's part of the rationale for Why Foray Quebec, to really develop the next generation of leaders in Quebec's English-speaking community. We don't want our community to be erased from Quebec society like what happened in the 70s, where there was a massive exodus of English speakers. And in my family, who's from Quebec, where very few left, only my father from his family decided to stay in Quebec. The rest, went to other provinces. And I don't think the English-speaking community wants to face another blow to the size of our community here. I think we want to stay and we want to live in a French province. And I love the French language. I'm a Francophile, not a Francophone. And I think myself and my peers who are all fully engaged in the French-speaking community are a testament to that as Anglophone youth or as English-speaking youth, we're happy to be engaged in the French-speaking community, but we do need to make it easy and make it possible for English-speaking youth to be able to navigate the Quebec economy, navigate the Quebec job market, and get deeply rooted into it.
Yeah, and you mentioned the beginning of that, how like you had an experience of actually meeting politicians kind of at your CEGEP and your views on politicians kind of changing over time. How has that evolved? Because I think a lot of people, including myself, right, we're kind of have a cynical view on politicians, or like they're all ultimately not leading change that we want to actually see happen. And so I guess how has your view changed, and what are certain things you've seen that has made you change your mind or change your view?
I mentioned that when I did meet the federal MP Isabelle Morin for NDG, Lachine Dorval, and the assistant for François Ouimet, the member of the National Assembly, I was invited to volunteer with both. I ended up doing an internship with federal MP Isabelle Morin in the NDG Lachine Dorval riding. So that was my first foray into the nonpartisan political world. I got to learn about the role of a member of parliament in the community, because all the MPs have a constituency office in their communities away from Ottawa where people can walk into. It's a little bit different with the pandemic, but in principle, there's a walk-in office. There are services to citizens offered to navigate federal government bureaucracy. And I got to see that a politician can really take citizens' issues and concerns that come from people locally and turn them into national campaigns ultimately. And I'll give you an example. There were some citizens that were concerned about animal welfare in our riding, and ultimately our member of parliament submitted a private member's bill to recognize that animals are sentient beings and that we can't be cruel to animals and that we have to protect animals. It just goes to show that people with ideas, even if you don't think it, can go far. And a member of parliament or a member of the National Assembly in Quebec is a vector of change and really can take small ideas and get something done about those. And it's not a fast process by any means. You have to be pretty patient if you want to drive change, especially at the national level. But ultimately, that's what their job is as politicians, and we should give them that chance to do that work.
Yeah, it's interesting because I went through the exercise of figuring out who represents me, in different levels of government. The mayor of my borough, there's the councillor, then there's my provincial representative, in the Quebec Assembly, and then federal. And I've sent them correspondence because I wanted to see what they had to say about the issue of sustainability and the environment and stuff, because I think it's really important. The fact that I had never really done that before, and I wasn't even literate in who represents me, right? I think maybe that is some of the problem, the education of the actual political system, right? People don't know who's representing them, or, when the election comes around, they'll see all the posters going around and then they'll make a decision based on how many posters they see or who their neighbor's voting for. How do you think people can get more engaged in the system and not be so passive? Like you said, they're really representing you, and they can even, the thing you mentioned was pretty amazing that happened. So how can we reconcile the fact that people do want change and do have ideas, but don't really know how to engage with their different representatives?
That's a great question. And I think I mentioned before that I think elected officials have some part of the responsibility to be reaching out to their citizens. And I remember when I did the internship in the Isabelle Morin's office that we were one of the constituency offices that were sending out the most flyers to citizens. And it really worked because people would write on the back of those cards, and they didn't even need to put a stamp on it. So that's another fun fact. If you want to reach out to your member of parliament, you don't need a stamp on it. You just have to write their name and Ottawa and their office number, and it'll be sent to them. But it would really work to get people's feedback about issues like, what comments do you want the MP to say when the budget is presented? What comments do you want the MP to take into account for this bill? So that's one part of it. I think, though, we have to recognize people are busy. We don't have time to sit through all of the proceedings of the House of Commons, all of the proceedings at these different levels of government. So that's why the media presents a nice summary for us at some points. But I think it is worth finding out when the issues that interest us are being discussed. I have to say, I hear a lot of people complaining about how they don't find the media is objective enough. And, my answer to people that are saying that is that, well, if you have a topic that is actually interesting you, for example, I'll think about the issue right now that we're having in Quebec with school boards and school board elections and abolishing school boards. It's a big kerfuffle right now because Quebec presented a bill to abolish school boards, and then the English community fought it. So they were not supposed to be school board elections, but now they're going to be school board elections. Anyway, that's one issue that is kind of interesting me because it's pretty important, I think, that we have schools that are well run. I mean, that's what it boils down to. There's not a whole lot of coverage on this, so I'm done work for the day now. So maybe in the evening, I'm going to go and see what I can find in the National Assembly recordings about the discussions that they've had about this issue, because they presented a bill, there were parliamentary hearings. If I wanted to really dive into it, I could do a little bit of research myself, and it's not even that tricky. I can put as much time as I want into it, but I can go and hear what the different parties were saying. I can hear what the community sector was saying by listening to all those recordings, and I'll just do that for that issue that interests me. I think that if individuals are interested by an issue that politicians are discussing or should be discussing, then there is a lot of information that you can go and consume about it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't even know that was a thing. You listen in on different discussions on different topics. And I think that's maybe even part of what my question was about. It's the fact that people don't even know that is, but you bring up the good point of like the media too is kind of having this facilitator role or kind of in between like mediator of should be kind of presenting the stuff boiled down to stuff people can understand. And yeah, I kind of wanted to build on that. Maybe you can expand a bit on that, what their role is in this similar issue of like political sphere. I'm kind of disenfranchised by a lot of the media I do see. It's very biased towards a certain narrative that I don't think fits with what I see. So how can people get to know what's really happening? And I guess you talked about like looking at the recordings. Like, is that something everyone should be doing? Like, how can we do these things to get more informed?
Traditional media is undergoing a lot of changes right now because, people want objective reporting. Every election cycle, the newspapers endorse a political party. That's something I still find kind of shocking when it happens right before an election. So I think we have to, realize that, the traditional model of media is kind of facing some difficulties. I'm still really grateful for the CBC. They have really strong journalistic standards, and the journalistic standards are available on their website, and it's an unbiased source of information. They're one of the only outlets that doesn't endorse a party flat out before the elections. I'm watching, though, with keen interest the surge in these alternative media outlets, podcasting too. It's like a newer type of reporting. First of all, not everyone is willing to pay for like a subscription access to either the alternative or the traditional media sources. I think both are relevant, though.
Yeah, that's a good point of like that dichotomy too between the different traditional and non-traditional, because I think that's probably where I get a bit dismayed. Like I don't turn to any traditional forms of media really because they do tend to be politicized. I wanted to switch gears a bit. When I first was getting ready for the podcast, I kind of didn't really know much about what you'd been up to since like high school, basically. I mean, I knew about Y for Y, but you have a website, right?
I may have made one at some point.
You haven't updated in a while, but like some of the lines kind of really stuck out for me because I have a similar kind of interest talking about sustainability, transportation, even like the psychology and marketing behind like transportation and how people move around in like cities. And I have this like interest as well too. And I even studied kind of urban planning because of similar type of interests. So how did you go from talking about these things and then you've kind of gotten shifted into the nonprofit and then like social economy sector and eventually the public sector?
I've been so interested in municipal issues, city issues, because I find that there are so many choices that need to be made about sustainable development. And when I was a kid growing up, we never had a car in my family. I always would walk or take transit or take my bike to get around. That was a bit of a difference between our family and a lot of other families that relied on the family car to get around on a lot of trips. Fast forward to today, it's really more clear than ever that we need to take pretty big steps to ensure that the global climate does not pass famous 1.5 degrees, to ensure that we can not have smog mornings very frequently in the summertime. Right now, what's on a lot of people's minds is the fires on the West Coast, the forest fires that happen in northern Quebec every couple years. Now there's a clock. I saw a photo today of a clock on a building in an American city that showed the time that we have left before it's going to be irreversible to stop climate change for the worst. So I think today and with Greta Thunberg's movement, that was something also that really brought into more people's vision and view that we really have to do something now to influence people's habits and get people to be able to change their habits to have less of a carbon footprint. remember when I was younger, I started to volunteer in municipal politics in Montreal, actually, with my local councillor growing up in NDG was from Projet Montréal. And I started to volunteer with that party. And I even sat on that party's board for a year. And I started a youth committee in that party. And we changed our bylaws so that there would always be a youth representative on the board. I think in municipal politics, there's a lot that can be done to change people's habits on a day-to-day basis. For instance, making it easier for people to choose public transit and to choose cycling as ways to get around the city. Those are two things that are high up on at least my priorities list as a city dweller to get my city to implement. I live in Gatineau, Quebec now. Issues are a little bit different than in Montreal, but at the end of the day, the city here is doing a lot to help that modal transfer from private cars to more sustainable ways to get around. But for a city administration, I think that should be one of their big battle horses to get that modal shift underway and to get people to leave their cars at home or sell their cars so that we don't rely on them as much. And don't get me wrong, I'm not anti-car. I myself, I drive if I have to go to Montreal, and I drive car sharing if I have to get a big load of groceries, which happens once every couple months. So I'm not against cars, but I do think that a lot needs to be done to get people to feel safer on their bikes and to get people to be able to use transit for all their trips, not just the trip to and from work, but also the trips that are around that, to get to the grocery store, to drop off your library books at the library, to go visit a friend in another neighborhood. All of that needs to be considered. That was another way that I got interested in politics, because the decisions that city council makes can really have a long-lasting impact on our lives.
Maybe you can even have a bigger impact on people's day-to-day through different channels instead of as an urban planner, which they're kind of governed by the city. Yeah, that's an interesting kind of way to frame it, I think. I wanted to get to know a bit more about how you got going with Y for Y, and you were the founder and president, and you mentioned you're stepping away after this, but how did kind of that idea come about for you? And then how did it go from just this idea into a full-on nonprofit and community that has continued to grow?
I think after going to an English high school in Quebec, it sort of put into perspective. I realized when I was leaving high school, I didn't have a lot of Francophone friends. I didn't have a lot of doors open towards the French-speaking community. And I realized that I was interested in public policies. The Quebec government operates exclusively in French. To break into that network, it would have required an additional effort on my part to break into that community, because there still are the two solitudes in Canada, English and French ultimately. And I would love for there to be more bridges between the two. I even went to a focus group about the situation of English-speaking youth in Quebec. At that moment, I met some other young people from a couple other parts of the province, and we realized that ultimately, whether we're from Montreal or from a rural part of Quebec, like the Lower North Shore, for instance, the struggle is the same. We have a very high level of French, but what I find sad and disappointing nowadays is that, English youth that are still in Quebec sometimes have to hide their English identity to try to be on a level playing field in front of employers who are trying to evaluate candidates, especially in the service industry. Like, I'm thinking about young people that might even just be applying to work at McDonald's. A manager might prefer to hire a French candidate because they won't get backlash if the Anglophone cashier makes a French mistake or hesitates or has an English accent. So some English-speaking youth in Quebec have to hide their identity to feel as if they're going to be treated equally. And B, that some English youth are talking about leaving the province and out-migration towards Ontario or any of the other provinces because they feel that they'll have an easier time breaking into their field of interest. I know one person that wanted to go work in the hockey industry, and in Quebec, the minor league hockey teams all use French heavily. He thought that it would be easier for him to get experience with one of the minor league teams in Ontario. This out-migration towards other provinces has been really well documented by Bill Flock and Joanne Pocock. It's really astounding that 70% of the English speakers that have doctorates will leave the province after their studies. And so the trend is more pronounced the higher level of education that the English-speaking youth have. So it's clear to me that we need to stop this out-migration. I think our English-speaking community deserves to stay here if we want to stay here and enjoy this joie de vivre. That's really part of the rationale and the motivation for me to see people like my friends. My brother is someone that tells me all the time that he thinks it's going to be easier to start a business in Ontario. And I wish that the government of Quebec would make more documentation accessible to Anglophones. I hear all the time people send me links of things on the government of Quebec website that are only in French. A couple of weeks ago, someone showed me this. Quebec has a board that is supposed to advocate for people with disabilities. They don't have a single Anglophone on their board. They don't have English on their website. So they're not representative of people with disabilities in the English community. And, that's just one example off the top of my head of how the government is not open and welcoming to English Quebecers. So there's a lot of work to do in terms of offering the service. And I'm not saying that it's all bad. It is a French province, and it's normal that people can be served in French, but don't close the door to Anglophones that are here and that want to live here and that want to contribute and want to live their lives in French. That's my message.
Yeah, it's an interesting topic too, because as someone in the same community, and it is a minority community, and it's something you don't necessarily think about a lot until you have to step outside of that community. And there are these challenges, and it's not only the actual language itself, but there's a lot of cultural and social other issues too, or other differences that come with having a different language as your main language. For example, like trying to find an employment or trying to find work in Quebec, it's kind of another layer of difficulty or another thing that makes it a bit harder, that at least I think sometimes too. But I also can't help but sometimes feel a bit, I don't know if guilty is the right word, but there's a little level of shame almost around the fact that I am not a perfect French speaker and part of that community, even though I live in Quebec. Some people would say, well, yeah, you're living in Quebec, right? So you got to deal with those consequences of being a minority there. So how do you think we can reconcile those two things, like being an English-speaking minority, but also willingly being part of a province and ultimately kind of this culture that is majoritarily French?
It's a delicate one, and it's a tricky one, because the English language throughout North America is the dominant force, and Quebec is the only jurisdiction that's French. As part of the English community, I think we have to make it clear that we're going to support French-speaking community in preserving the language and ensuring that the French language can have a special place in Quebec as the official language. And, I'm really happy to live in Quebec, and I think that I'm more lucky than my cousins who grew up in other provinces, because I got to learn French at a very young age and got to practice more consistently than they did. It's a real plus that I grew up in Quebec. That said, we have a right to access some services in English, as all Canadians do, from coast to coast to coast. So we have to remind folks that we do exist, that we're here, that we're willing to participate in a French Quebec, but that you can't trample on our right, and that our presence is not by any means trying to step on anyone's toes. Our presence is, we're here and we like to live here, and we happen to be Anglophone, and we have an important place to play in Quebec.
We kind of touched on this before too, talking about the political sphere and my journey that I mentioned of trying to discover the different levels of government and who's representing me. So ultimately, how do you think people can get involved in what's happening around them, like locally? I think we've seen that it's very important to know what's going on locally, and that also local changes can have a big impact. What would you say to people that want to get more involved? How can they do that? And ultimately, how can they make positive change in their communities?
Just thinking back to my own experience, the way that I sort of threw myself into the deep end and got a crash course about Quebec politics was by running as a candidate in the 2014 election, going on the radio, participating in debates. So I think that getting involved in a party, if there's a party that you're interested in at the federal or provincial or even municipal levels, go get involved with them. All of them are looking for volunteers all the time. If you're not convinced by any of the party's platforms or any of the leaders, ask questions. If you're not sure, for instance, which provincial party is best for you, well, ask questions and look at their track records too. When election campaigns come around, it's hard for me to just want to vote on a platform, because that's just a document that their election teams prepared. For parties that have been at the House of Commons for a long time, like the Conservatives and Liberals, they all have track records. Both of them have been in power, and the NDP's been in power provincially in different provinces. So we can look at what actually happened when these parties were in government. Harper, we can't forget, he made massive cuts to the public service, and he cut scientists. Trudeau, what's his track record? Well, for scientists, he still hasn't quite reestablished all of the funds to public science that Harper cut. So he talks a good talk, but he hasn't, we're still under the levels of science research and development than we were under the Harper years. So looking closely at their track records is important, I think, not just in a campaign listening to the nice announcements, because it's easy to recycle press releases and announcements every 10 years. People have short memories. Maybe I shouldn't generalize. Politicians will think that people have short memories. That's what I'm trying to say. And politicians will think that people are not going to recall their party's promises from 5 or 10 years back.
Yeah, how did that go when you ran for government? What was that experience like?
It was a lot of fun. I was in the Hochschläge Maisonneuve riding. I was in geography at the time as a student, so naturally I ran with the provincial Greens. I was pretty autonomous during my campaign. I chose to run in the Hochschläge riding in Montreal because it was a neighborhood that I didn't know. I had never really been there except to go to the Olympic Stadium. So I was curious to use that experience to A, learn about a new neighborhood of Montreal that I hadn't been familiarized with, and B, to learn about Quebec political issues, because back then we were coming out of the Charbonneau Commission. There was a lot of corruption being exposed, and it was shortly after the student protests when the Liberals tried to increase tuition fees for students. We were coming out of a time when concrete slabs were falling on highways, killing people and almost killing people. I was really, as a citizen, as a young person, upset with those big trends that we were seeing. Thought that, if the Liberals haven't really committed to making that shift, getting out of that corruption, if the PQ was, still very anti-Anglophone, QS, they're still sovereigntists, I wasn't really sure. So I decided to just run myself as a candidate in a party where I could have a fairly autonomous campaign, but still be sort of somewhat structured by a party platform. It was a pretty positive experience. I'm not saying that everyone has to run, but I am encouraging people to get involved with a party if they think that it might speak to them. As I said, if you're not sure about which party you adhere to, then look at their track records and go watch the National Assembly channel or CPAC for the federal parliament, because there's a lot of information that you can consume on your own.
Building off of that idea and leading to change and how we can get involved, what are some things that you kind of see on the horizon, or some things that you hope to materialize, whether that's in Montreal, in Quebec, in Gatineau, or whether it's more broadly as a nation or just in the world? What are some things that you're really passionate about or looking forward to happening?
I'm not 100% sure what the future holds for me personally. After my my mandate of president, I was hoping to take at least a little bit of rest from volunteering. I do definitely want to get back into a cause that gets me excited, and I love volunteering and community building. And in my job at PIPS, I'm really fortunate to be able to work on issues that public servants are facing. And we were going to hold a lobby day. Hopefully we can do that virtually next year. We're focusing on outsourcing of public services, which is a huge problem for the federal government right now. They spent over $11 billion in contracts on what we call the phantom public service. That is, a team of consultants that come in, take the knowledge and leave at the end of their contract, which is costly for taxpayers, detrimental for recruitment and retention of public servants because we're not advancing them correctly, and needs to be corrected by hiring full-time permanent staff. That's what Canadians need ultimately. They need a full-time, not contract public service. So that's something that I'm working a lot on right now. Another issue that I'm also working on with my work is, of course, the COVID-19 return to the office for some people, and how we're going to move forward from this pandemic, because right now everyone that can essentially is working from home. But for those that do have to go into the office, it's pretty tricky. There have been some COVID-19 outbreaks in critical government offices, the meteorologists at their office. And, if there is a COVID-19 outbreak in their office, well, we're just not going to have weather services, or the weather services are going to have to be done by people on the other side of the country. So it's pretty important that we can find solutions to ensuring that public servants are safe. So I'm happy to help our president work on those issues. Another big one is the Phoenix pay system, which we're still stuck with. It's pretty scandalous, I think, that the government can't pay their employees the right amount and on time because they implemented this failed pay system because it can't be fixed. They've put out a call for tender. They're looking at different companies that can build the new pay system for the government. And finally, they've agreed to take the input of the IT professionals working in the government. Last time when they built Phoenix, they didn't really take into account the suggestions of the in-house public service. So this time they're going to ensure that that doesn't happen again. And hopefully we can have a pay system that's working, because frankly, it's causing us too many problems. Like, people are worried about just getting what they're owed. And, when it happens to students who are only employed for 8 months, and at the end of that 8 months, they still haven't gotten their salary, well, it doesn't look good for the government. It doesn't allow them to build a strong public service that can help Canadians, which is really what we need. And we saw that with the different professionals that were building the CERB. It was so critical for Canada to have a public service that could quickly do something so that we could get money in people's pockets, people who needed it the most. And I did want to draw another parallel to like what we're seeing right now with the pandemic, where most of the COVID-19 cases are people in their 20s. I'm constantly thinking about my friends who are not fortunate enough to work from home and are working like on the front lines, so that are in close contact with other people. I'm thinking about like grocery workers and bartenders. Even in those establishments where they're following the protocols, there are still outbreaks. This is a coronavirus that spreads so easily that even when the public health guidelines are respected, there's still a risk of transmission or of something going wrong. So I'm cautiously optimistic that we can get out of this pandemic safely, but it's the biggest crisis of one of the biggest economic crises of our lifetimes. And it's not going to be easy moving forward for young people who just graduating now. I'm hoping to do what I can to ensure that Canada can get out of this in good shape.
Kind of wanted to wrap things up, and maybe you can share with us a link for us to look at, or something you've done in the past. What are some things you want people to go look at?
Yeah, well, I would encourage people to go to whyforwhyquebec.org. So that's the number 4 in there, whyforwhyquebec.org, and you can find out all the information about our news updates, positions that we've taken on different political issues that are affecting English-speaking youth. You can check out our Flickr, which is accessible from that website, where we have photos from our past activities. You can add your name to some campaigns too on that website. So I'm encouraging people to do that. And yeah, to follow the Why for Why Quebec podcast, it's going to roll out in the next few months. So that's exciting news. Stay tuned. And if you're interested in following me on Twitter at Richmond Malcolm, RichmondMalcolm, you can add me on LinkedIn too if you're interested in talking about professional projects, campaigns, nonprofit, advocacy.
So yeah, thank you again, Malcolm, for coming on and speaking with us.
Thanks, Toby, again for having me. Have a great day, and yeah, best of luck with this podcast and your future episodes.
Thank you.